So yeah, it's great to be here and great to have so many at this very important discussion. So although initially written over 170 years ago, Marx's writings on alienation are still of enormous value today in helping us understand the degrading and dehumanizing effects capitalism has on working class people. And you could see how someone might read Marx on this subject and deem it irrelevant, because the working class, the type of work that we do, the conditions and standards of living are surely too different to compare. And of course, it goes without saying that capitalism has dramatically changed since Marx's time. And although we acknowledge these changes, we understand that the same economic system and the same class relations continue to exist today. So we read this like all aspects of Marxism, not as some dogma, but as ideas that need to be creatively and dynamically applied to the present. And that's something we hope to do today. So I'll be focusing on more the context in which Marx developed his theory of alienation and what is unique about it. And Bryan will draw out just how relevant this is today to help us understand the experiences and conditions of the working class. So first of all, Marx didn't come up with the notion of alienation. It's a term or something that has been used over centuries to describe a contradiction between a person and the world. A sense of loss or not belonging. But particularly right before Marx's time and around Marx's time in the early 1800s, this idea gained prominence in the philosophy of German idealism, but also the art and poetry of Romanticism. And that's no coincidence, because in this period, capitalism is still relatively young. It's coming into its own as the dominant economic system. So we see industrialization, urbanization. We see the destruction of feudalism and older economic formations. And with that, with those economic relationships, the uprooting of traditions, of ways of life, of old forms of living. And as Marx later said in the Communist Manifesto, all that is solid melts into air. And this describes some of the rapid changes and new social relations that led many to question the nature of humanity and our place in the world. So these mostly bourgeois writers and artists in different ways gave expression to a sense of anxiety and of atomization, which was being felt by more and more people in these new and fastly growing cities. And it's these ideas, particularly from like the ideas of the philosopher Hegel, that Marx was engaging with. But as Marx is radicalizing, he's linking these to political economy and the socialist ideas of his time, and also his own experiences under the repressive Prussian state. And so the reading I sent out, the manuscripts on alienation in 1844, Marx is only 26 when he writes this. He's living in exile in Paris, but he's also fully in tune, fully understands the dire conditions of workers in France and across Europe at the time. And an example that the same year, you have a huge revolt of the Silesian weavers in Prussia, which saw riots of thousands protesting against poverty, hunger, horrendous conditions. And Marx is following these events, understanding the conditions and the consciousness of the working class. But And these events, him being understanding this, I think you can see that in the text on alienated labor. But unlike some of the bourgeois philosophers or artists, Marx is trying to understand the material roots of workers' despair. He understands that it's not a result of some eternal feature of human nature, but down to an economic system that is inherently exploitative and oppressive, which is capitalism. So Marx sees the source of workers' alienation being in their relationship to the means of production. Because under capitalism, the means through which wealth and resources are produced, so mines, factories, plants, machinery, all these are concentrated in the hands of the capitalist class. But in pre-capitalist societies, this was different. Even the most oppressed classes, like serfs, they could produce their own means of subsistence and keep at least some of it for themselves. So they kept, they made shelter, whether clothing, crops, and they gave some, or some was taken from them, but they kept things they produced. And that's not to romanticize that in any way. It was obviously quite brutal conditions, but it's to say that the experience of alienation felt by working class people under capitalism is distinct and new. Why is that the case? Because capitalism brings into existence a working class that has no means to produce wealth, no means to produce even basic subsistence like food or clothing, no land, no property, no machinery. So in order to survive, we are forced to sell the one thing we do have, which is our labor power. But in doing so, we are giving up a huge portion of our life to someone else. And this is how we can understand alienation. And there are a number of ways that this plays out, that this happens. So first, we no longer do we plan what we're going to create, what we're going to make in accordance with a need that arises. Yeah, of course, we can, in our spare time, we can make food. You might even make some types of clothing or new tools. But you cannot survive on this as a worker. You need to work for a wage. That means the products of our labor, the things we create, they're not used, they're not consumed, they're not enjoyed by us. They're not made with any of our input. Because what we create is dictated by the bosses, by the system of production, things that are taken and sold as commodities. So we are alienated from the products we create, but also the process, the activity through which we create them. We have no say over how we create something. And you see this, workers stop using, we don't use skills or different capabilities. We don't rely on our intuition or talents when we're at work. It's a process completely outside of our control. And even innovation in technology, in machinery, some might make work less physically exhausting, but it actually makes it more tedious, more boring, more alienating. And of course, Marx here is looking at a real process of, small producers going from small workshops, and they're going into major factories where the tasks are much more repetitive, much more regulated. Your individuality is completely stripped, as you're engaging in the exact same motions, the exact same rhythms of machinery of the work process. And a very kind of strong way that Marx puts it is the worker does not freely develop, the worker does not develop freely his physical and mental energy, but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. And it's important to note that this experience of alienation doesn't just end once you leave work. We're alienated not just as individuals in a specific workplace, but in a more general sense from the world, from nature, from society. And so much that Marx says workers, humanity are alienated from their species being. Now, this can sound like some fixed, even biological idea of human nature, but it's not really. For Marx, what separates humans from animals is what he calls our conscious life activity. And Marx sees labor as something more than just work in the narrow sense, but something much broader. It's a basic aspect of human existence, the way we interact with our environment, the way we consciously and collectively transform nature in all sorts of different ways. And it's precisely this that capitalism distorts by separating producers from what we produce, how we produce them. And Marx says if we're alienated from ourselves, it logically follows we're alienated from others. We don't recognize particularities, the depth, the diversity of emotions and experiences. We see in others what we see in ourselves, just workers reduced to activities through which we don't fully express ourselves. So I wanted to just again go back to the idea of species being, of human nature that Marx talks about. And there's something quite revolutionary about what he's saying. Because for him, our species being is nothing less than the huge potential we possess to be creative, to shape the world around us, to shape ourselves and our relationships with others in a whole myriad of possibilities. And here, in my opinion, we see an intrinsic feature of Marxism. And that's a fundamental optimism in the potential of working class people. And I think it's interesting to note that I think this is what distinguishes Marxism from maybe existentialist philosophy. I say that because existentialists also talk about alienation quite a lot. They correctly see so much alienation between ourselves, between others in our lives. They correctly identify that. But their conclusion is that the world is devoid of all meaning. The world is devoid of all meaning. This is just part of human nature. This, of course, is pessimistic, has, I think, more of a social basis in the petty bourgeoisie, and also there's no perspective on how to change things. Whereas Marxism, there is, because as I've said before, Marx sees the source of alienation in an economic system of capitalism, which needs to be overthrown if we're ever to overcome this alienation. And just to finish up, I think what makes Marx's theory of alienation stand the test of time was that even though he was well aware of the exhaustion, the disease, the injuries that workers faced back then, still do today, he still felt the need to go deeper into the extent of dehumanization. And this is before psychology was really a developed field of study. And he's really, so he's really getting into the psyche of working class people and our experience under capitalism. And regardless of how jobs have changed in many different ways, workers today, we still have that same basic relationship to the means of production. And so we still remain alienated in our work, alienated in our relationships, alienated from the world and from nature in general. And Bryan now will take over and really draw this out and show how that is the case.
You know, Marx's theory of alienation is deeply relevant today, but has obviously taken on a lot of new dimensions more than 170 years after Marx wrote. Strengthening this understanding can also raise our own sights about how thoroughly workers' struggle and socialism can change the world. The theory of alienation rests on a basic idea that everyone instinctively understands. It's an idea that permeates every aspect of working class people's lives. This simple idea is that you don't have control over your life while you're working. Virtually everyone knows this is true, and it becomes a revolutionary idea when you draw bigger conclusions from it. At branch discussions on this topic, how I begin it is we go around in a circle and everyone there talks about a workplace experience, a way you felt sad or angry about the lack of control you, your coworkers, or the working class as a whole has over your work. I can't do that with 141 comrades, but I'll just communicate a few of those that stood out to me that illustrate various aspects of alienation. I'll start with myself. My most alienating job ever was when I worked in a call center. The call center was set up so that there was a machine that made it so that once someone hung up on you, immediately another phone call started. So insane pace of work. They were able to pay us less than minimum wage because we got paid mainly based on commission on how many sales we made. The people we called was a specialized list of people that were vulnerable to high pressure sales, mainly elderly people, and we were selling them things they didn't need. How this is alienating is obvious. Low pay, terrible pace of work. You're doing something that society doesn't need and in fact is bad for society. A much different example, a comrade who was a union worker, highly skilled manual laborer in the energy industry. Really likes the work, very high paying, very challenging, lots of rights on the job, lots of control even, you could say, his union had over the workplace. But what made it so alienating for him was the fact that his workplace was deeply polluting in the energy sector rather than his skills being used for sustainable, environmentally sustainable energy. Another example, a comrade that worked at a shelter for women who were survivors of domestic abuse. Obviously contributing to helping society in a big way, but the job is the basis of a sick society of capitalism that we live in the first place. The final example I'll give is of a very high-paid professional, a cancer doctor. Obviously, we would need lots more cancer doctors under socialism. But what made his work, I'll let Marcus talk. What made his work so shockingly and deeply alienating from the profit motive was the fact that he was only strictly given 3 minutes to talk to every patient, no matter what their diagnosis is. If he was telling someone they were going to die within days, he had 3 minutes to talk to them. So all of these examples are obviously given from an advanced capitalist country. We can imagine, for instance, the alienation of a gold miner in South Africa, like those in the strikes that we helped lead, living in shacks while pulling, huge wealth for the capitalists out of the ground in unsafe conditions. So in Marx's time, he focuses on workers making tangible commodities in factories, but the service sector jobs that millions of people are in today are no less alienating. And this is becoming even more so with the proletarianization of professionals. Millions of workers share memes about how they have to pretend to have emotions that they don't have while they're carrying out work, which is different than factory work, for instance. I think all that's easily understood. But one aspect of what Marx talks about in his theory of alienation, I think would not be widely understood, which is the idea that work should be a joyful, life-affirming activity. That work should connect us to other people, to our species as a whole, and to nature. This sounds outlandish because the opposite is true under capitalism. But I want to try to give some evidence of why this is true. One is we should look at what many people's hobbies are, what we do for fun outside of work. Many of these are pre-capitalist forms of production, gardening, fishing, crocheting, etc., etc. We often experience more joy when we consume the things made from these hobbies as well. And other hobbies today, like video games on the internet, can often involve mass cooperation with lots of people, which is enjoyable as well. But now in the chat column, I'm going to send a video that shows how work could be life-affirming from a source coming from the most unlikely place. This is from one of the top management schools for the capitalist class. And they're trying to figure out, how can we make workers more productive? They found that two things make workers more productive than anything. One is control over their work. And two is feeling like what they're doing benefits society as a whole. And higher pay doesn't hurt either. Capitalism can't do any of these things. And even the advances in technology under capitalism, rather than lessening the burden on working class people and humanity as a whole, can make us more alienated as automation brings on the threat of layoffs. As Marxists, we know that relations in the economy and at work affect all other things, like the family, like the state, etc. Flowing from this, if we see that alienation is present in all forms of work, then it's also present in all things produced by work and in all social relationships surrounding those things. This can be reflected in more obvious things like oppression, war, unemployment, anxiety about environmental destruction. We can see alienation in all those things. But also we can guess at how it affects us, how this lack of control over our lives affects us in all aspects of our lives, not just those that seem immediately political. So finally, I want to wrap up on how Marx talks about alienation from nature under capitalism. So many people, if they have the time, etc., their hobbies also involve a connection to nature. It's something that many people feel deeply. They'll go hiking, they'll go to the ocean, etc. But when we think about nature, we think about parts of the world that are untouched by humans, And this is absolutely absurd. It shows how deeply alienation has affected us, because everything made through capitalist production was not made based on any decision of any human being. Not even the capitalists made these decisions. But rather, our surroundings created by human production are made mainly on the basis of the blind alley of profits. So staying on the subject of nature, I'm going to get a little bit weird, a little bit strange, a little bit sciencey here for a minute. So the Earth has existed for 4.5 billion years. Within those 4.5 billion years, there were 4 eras of the existence of Earth up until capitalism. Scientists say that the amount that capitalism has affected the planet means we've now entered a 5th era, and this one isn't going to last 1 billion years. So this is horrifying in a lot of ways, but I think also it should make us extremely motivated, not just to change the world, but also think about the possibilities if the working class can liberate humanity through socialist revolution. If our class wins, then for the first time ever, conscious activity will be the main factor in the entire landscape of the planet. It shows what's possible for human potential, and also shows how unambitious the reformists are. They can't even redistribute wealth, let alone do what humanity is actually capable of. In our material, when we write about unleashing human potential, we often talk about how the best scientists in the world sometimes work on weapons instead of things like curing cancer or environmental sustainability. We maybe write about how workers have not enough time to pursue creative interests, or maybe we go further when we talk about unleashing human potential and talk about how people struggling to meet basic necessities could have done so much more with their lives. But all of this is inadequate, because really socialism and working class rule could go so much further in unlocking human potential. Not only could our basic necessities be met, but we could do what these management acts wish they could do to make us more profitable. Which is have working class people control their lives and to do socially useful work that motivates people to produce more. This is how socialism can get the best out of humanity. And also the theory of alienation shows that capitalism can't bring this about. It's only our class and our movement that can achieve that.